interview where we go beyond the headlines and ask more esoteric questions to get to what's really going on. The peace deal between Israel and Hamas may be on shaky ground. Israel striking Gaza after it said Hamas violated the ceasefire. There's another international conflict that now President Trump wants to focus on, the war in Ukraine. How close are we actually to peace there, with the president heading to Budapest to meet with Russia's Vladimir Putin? Here to talk about it, Dr. Ronald Suny, a leading expert in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Dr. Suny, thank you so much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure, Hilary.
Let's begin with that first point that I posited. How close are we to peace?
It's always hard to tell, but there have been some important developments lately. And I think that we may be more satisfactory one for one side or another. There's the end of the two conflicts that are the major ones we would talk about, the struggle over Palestine and the Ukrainian struggle. Both of them, it seems to me, are going to end in very unfair and one-sided solutions. But, you know, that's the way of the world. The win usually goes to the more powerful, and the side that either loses or is weaker has to give in to realities that it doesn't want to accept.
I want to jump right into NATO and the credibility of NATO as an international organization and the specific belief we have in Article 5. If aspirant nations who want to join NATO see that even the potential of advancement of Russia here, because really you could view the ceding of territory by Ukraine to Russia as an advancement, clearly, of Russia into Europe. Is NATO's future at stake as well by whatever peace deal is agreed to?
If, in fact, Russia gets what it wants, if President Trump sides with President Putin, and that seems to be the way it is today, though, you know, with this very capricious president, things change from day to day, so one doesn't know. But today it looks like, after he took that phone call from Putin, that President Trump is likely to give in to what Putin's maximal demands may be. If that happens, of course, that will be a serious blow to NATO. NATO is not that powerful or able to act independently without the United States. And the United States is a kind of loose cannon right now in terms of its relationships with NATO. So NATO is on a back foot right now, and yet it has been such a successful alliance since the end of World War II and since the end of the Cold War, that it will probably come out in a new form in Europe with or without the United States.
Do you think NATO's teleology has been totally invalidated by even Russia's seizure of Crimea and the fact that Crimea will likely never ever go back to Ukraine? And we're now looking at a world where, as you say, the United States is necessary to make this international organization really anything of substance. Should we just kind of pretend like NATO at this point is highly ineffective?
NATO was very effective during the Cold War. That was a very tight alliance against communism, against Soviet expansionism, against the empire of the Soviet Union that it had domestically and in Eastern Europe. That it held, and you had the Cold War as a result of the standoff between the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, and NATO, led by the United States. With the end of the Cold War in 1991, there was a real question, historically, at that time. Should NATO continue? The Soviet Union was gone. There were lots of plans to bring Russia into a better relationship with the West. This was Gorbachev's idea. When Gorbachev fell, it was Yeltsin's idea. When Yeltsin handed over the presidency to Vladimir Putin, it was Putin's idea as well. And for some years, there were arrangements. But Russia over time felt humiliated, felt that it wasn't being listened to. The West no longer wanted to treat it as a serious great power, and then began talking about, of course, NATO expansion and even including Georgia and Ukraine, which would have practically surrounded Russia in the West by NATO countries. And at that point, a new kind of Cold War was set up between Russia, NATO, with the United States as well in the West. And that situation ultimately led us, it seems to me, to the war in Ukraine unnecessarily. In other words, we had a period since the end of the Soviet Union of thinking of other ways to form international relations in Eurasia. We squandered that opportunity, and now we're faced not only with the diminished NATO, if in fact Putin wins this war, but with also a Ukraine that will be truncated and will appear to be the result of a failure of NATO and the West.
Yeah, I wonder how much of this is sort of being discussed without the full context of history, in that, and I think it maybe makes people uncomfortable, or maybe they've forgotten that Stalin really saw Ukraine as the bulwark of his Soviet imperium. And Putin's ideology somewhat mirrors that. It's almost parallel, that he believes Ukraine's borders as drawn were never even really legitimate, and sees Ukraine as an appendage. And some of that ideology isn't really taken into consideration in the discussion around how Ukraine will eventually be drawn up. I'm not saying that either Stalin or Putin are right, but that historical through line means a lot. Of course, there are Ukrainians who have a distinct sense of identity, distinct cultural heritage, distinct language. But something like 30% of Ukrainians speak Russian, and a percentage of those would consider themselves to be, in many ways, culturally Russian. How do you interpret all of that?
There's a lot of questions in what you just said.
Yeah.
First of all, Ukraine was never really fully united until the Soviet period, right? But for a long time, perhaps even centuries, a distinct identity developed in the areas, many of the areas that we now call Ukraine. So a language developed, idea that among intellectuals particularly, that the Ukrainians were different from Russians. But Russians always had the idea, at least the ruling elite in Tsarist Russia, had the idea that, oh, no. Ukrainians are little Russians. They are not, they're like Russians, but they're just slightly different. And there are three kinds of Russians. There are white Russians, Belarus, there's little Russians, that's Ukrainians, and then there are great Russians, and of course that what we call Russians. And that was an imperial view. It was a vision from St. Petersburg and from Moscow, the capitals of Tsarist Russia. That's a very conservative view. Meanwhile, Ukrainians were developing their own national sense. And ironically, that national sense consolidated and grew under the Soviets, because it was under the Soviets that a non-independent, non-sovereign Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic developed. And in that republic, particularly in the 1920s, but it never quite stopped, Ukrainian culture developed. There was a very flourishing Ukrainian cinema and so forth. So Ukrainians became more Ukrainian under the Soviets. But as you move through the Soviet period, particularly after Stalin consolidated his power, there were attacks on Ukrainian nationalists. There were attacks on what we call Ukrainian national communists. And Ukraine was under a lot of pressure to Russify, to become more like Russians. Now, by the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there were about 30% of the people in Ukraine who were either Russian by nationality and spoke Russian as well as Ukrainian often, and many Ukrainians who were Russophones. That is, they also spoke Russian, and they thought about this as something that you could shift between. Now, in that period, before the Maidan events of 2014, the Russian annexation of Crimea, the 2022 invasion by the Russians and so forth. In that period, from let's say 1991 to 2014, Ukraine was a divided country. Sometimes people would vote for pro-Russian presidents. Sometimes they would vote for anti-Russian presidents. The western part of Ukraine was very nationalistic and very anti-Russian. The eastern part of Ukraine, Donbas, Luhansk, etc., was very much philo-Russian, pro-Russian, as was Crimea. And you would have this shift, this kind of balance, moving back and forth. And of course, Putin, who wanted to make sure that Ukraine stayed within the Russian sphere of influence and didn't fall under Western or fall into the Western camp, Putin was happy to deal with this balance, to try to influence with soft power or hard soft power or oil prices, etc. And so there was this loose balance. That balance was upset in 2014 with the Maidan demonstrations, when the pro-Russian president, Yanukovych, fled to Russia, fearful for his life, and the parliament of Ukraine in Kyiv swung toward the west. And now Ukraine looked like it was going to be part of a Western bloc, a Western alliance. Putin, at that point, I would say, panicked and immediately seized with the little green men the province of the peninsula of Crimea. And that started a kind of intense conflict from 2014 on. At the same time, Putin then kind of helped and supported those in the eastern part of Ukraine, in Donbas, who wanted to stay with Russia or were fearful of this Western turn, this really somewhat anti-Russian turn in the center and in the western part of Ukraine. So there was a kind of insurrection, and the Russians supported that. And eventually, when Ukraine was attacking that area, Putin sent troops in, and you had a low-grade but very, very bloody war going on. And then when in 2022, it seemed that, again, Putin might lose influence in Ukraine, and there was effort in the West to help Ukraine, and the anti-Russian government in Ukraine, Putin then invaded in full force in February of 2022 Ukraine, and we have the war and now the stalemate that we have today. I want to make one more point.
Okay.
Since we're talking this historical thing. You stop me if I go on too long.
No, go ahead.
I would say that Ukraine is now more united as a nation under these conditions, more Ukrainian, more anti-Russian, more pro-Western, more dedicated to democracy than it ever was before. And who is responsible for that? Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. By invading Ukraine, by seizing Crimea, by claiming 20% of what President Trump's called property in Ukraine, basically Putin has made Ukrainians, more anti-Russian, because Ukrainians are not going to give up the land, at least not without a fight, though now they're in a very precarious position, and I imagine we'll be talking about that.
Let's get to the specifics of territory and how it might be drawn up. I've heard from a number of people, I think we've even discussed it here before, that Crimea is definitely never going back to Ukraine, that Russian President Vladimir Putin would never cede Crimea back to Ukraine. Is it part of any peace deal? Luhansk, Donetsk might be also territories that would be ceded potentially to Russia, maybe areas along the Sea of Azov. What do you see as a territorial breakdown in a peace deal, potentially?
Well, you're absolutely right. That is, Crimea is part of Russia now. That is, it's part of the Russian constitution. And Putin, even though he has not fully conquered the area of Donbas, he's claimed and put in the Russian constitution claims to a series of provinces. I call them the crescent, that include Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and so forth. So these are all, from Putin's point of view, already Russia. And he wants to complete that hold because he doesn't own absolutely, or doesn't possess militarily absolutely. There's small parts that haven't yet been conquered by the Russians and that the Ukrainians are holding out. And apparently, there are reports in the Financial Times that after he had this recent phone call with Putin, that in fact he has told Putin that he wants those areas and he would stop the war if he's given those areas in exchange for some other areas in the north, which he doesn't care so much about. And apparently Trump, if this report in the Financial Times is correct, and there's much collaborated news about it, quite angrily and with a lot of expletives to Zelensky. When Zelensky met with him, Zelensky came to the White House thinking he was going to negotiate about Tomahawk weapons, but in fact, Trump knocked over the maps. He said, I don't care about these red lines anymore. You've got to concede this. And basically talked about Putin has got this property. They kept using the word property as if territory of a nation is like some kind of real estate deal. And that Zelensky had to give this up. Let's see if all of this is true, if these reports make sense. They certainly sound quite plausible, though as I searched through the internet, I could find very little collaboration directly about these reports, except something that appeared 3 hours ago in the Financial Times, which is a very venerable and respected journal.
Do you see historical echoes here with the Sovietization after that happened in Eastern Europe, and also realignments in, say, Yalta, Potsdam settlements, post-World War II?
Well, I thank you so much for these historical questions. I'm primarily a historian rather than a political scientist, though I served in both aspects. But let's go back to World War II. World War II in Europe was fought on two fronts, the Western and Eastern. In the West, the Nazis won quickly, drove the British off the continent, and it wasn't until 1944 that finally the Western Allies, led by the Americans, landed at Normandy. Now, the bulk of the fight against the Nazis and the fascists was carried out in the East by the Soviet Union, right? The Americans on all fronts in World War II lost 405,000 soldiers, right? The Soviets lost 7 million soldiers, and because they were occupied by the Nazis, who carried out genocidal exterminations against Slavs to create what Hitler wanted, which was the Lebensraum, living room for Germans, the Soviets lost a total of 27 million people, a huge loss. And then they began pushing the Nazis back. They pushed them through Poland. The Soviet army ended the Holocaust. They liberated Auschwitz, that's the day we mark as Holocaust Memorial Day, and the camps of Poland. And they took Berlin. They ended the Nazi regime. So as a result of that victory and the huge effort, the Western Allies had to make concessions to the Soviets, which they did at Tehran and most importantly at Yalta. And they basically recognized, though they hoped the Soviets wouldn't clamp down so ruthlessly, that the countries of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, most particularly, that these countries would fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. And eventually they would be totally dominated by Stalin and the Soviet Union. So that is basically what began the Cold War. It was the result of the victory of the Soviet Union, of the sacrifice of the Soviet Union to defeat the greatest peril that the West and democracy and capitalism had ever met, that is Nazism. Indeed, you could say that the Soviet Union saved the world for capitalist democracy, because they then became a backward, limited, isolated camp that was less developed than the West. And that's basically the outline. Now, the events in the 2014 and 2022 in Ukraine are quite different. It's a much smaller conflict, and there it was an idea by Putin, I believe very, very firmly, that he could take over Kiev quickly. He could make a huge move into Ukraine, decapitate the state, get rid of Zelensky one way or another, and turn Ukraine into a kind of satellite, a non-sovereign state that would be dependent on Russia, something like Belarus today. And that would satisfy his view that Russians, Belarusians, and Great Russians are all one people. I don't believe that he ever thought in his wildest dreams that he would eliminate Ukrainians as a people or as a nation. But he would change, if he didn't succeed that way, he'd change the boundaries and maybe take territory from Ukraine. Well, Putin lost that first war. The Ukrainians fought bravely, and they pushed the Russians back. And so Putin had to change his view, and from that, taking all of Ukraine and making a satellite state, he developed the view that he would just take some territory, that eastern part, maybe 20%, of Ukraine, that a buffer zone, he would integrate that into Russia, and that would be what the war would be about. It ended up in a war of attrition, a stagnation that we're watching today. Why Russia needs to be bigger when it's already the largest state in the world, largest country in the world.
By land mass, by land mass.
Yes, by land mass, yeah. And cannot govern itself that efficiently. This is something that befuddles me. But for Putin, it seems in his imperial dreams, I guess, and his fantasies, is necessary.
Okay, we only have about 5 minutes, and I'm gonna, even though this is gonna go online like this, just move a little bit to your right, because you're getting cut off just a tiny little bit to your right.
Does that work?
A tiny bit more. Okay. Yeah, our viewers will forgive us for that, but I just want to make sure that we have you in frame. Okay, so let's talk about the levers of power that the United States has. It is the greatest power in the country, and we have so many sanctions that have been levied against Russia, and still the estimates are that between 15 and 20 billion dollars are earned every month by Russia from oil and gas exports, and that begs the question that without some kind of peace deal that doesn't also include some sort of economic restructuring, that Russia could just continue its entrenchment and rebuild its military, which has taken a hit, but not substantial. And then historically, say, if you look at the 1974 Jackson-Vanik Amendment, that went on for decades. And it didn't at all stop Soviet desires for imperialism and expansion. So how much can the United States pull the lever of secondary sanctions, which President Vladimir Zelensky was talking about this morning, and see it have an effect on Russia? It hasn't so far, and historically it doesn't seem that sanctions do the trick.
I agree with you, your last statement very, very strongly. That is, the sanctions don't work, and you can get around them very easily. And you see that India is still buying oil, and China is supplying various goods, and Korea is supplying not only weapons but men. And these things don't work. What works is a victory or defeat on the battlefield, and there the Russians, despite the stagnation, have the upper hand. And the longer the war goes on, the more losses for both sides, but ultimately it'll probably end up with a territorial gain, a terrible territorial gain for the Russians at a huge human and material cost, and a loss for the Ukrainians. If the Trump administration has indeed sided with Putin, it's a cruel end to the war, but in some ways it's realistic. It would bring peace. In the same way that in Gaza, basically Trump gave Netanyahu what he wanted. with various vague promises to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians who had lost the war and suffered 67,000 deaths at the hands of the Israelis, genocidal killing and massacre, basically had to give in. And so we're seeing two very sad, tragic endings to two very unnecessary, horrific conflicts.
All right, we're almost out of time, but clearly there have to be some other parallels that can be drawn between the deal that was figured out between Hamas and Israel, even though that it appears the ceasefire may have been broken now. It still was considered a legendary deal and something that at least is advancing the prospect of peace. What can be learned? What can be learned from the pressure that Vladimir Zelensky says needs to be put on Putin, and that behind the scenes allegedly was happening with Benjamin Netanyahu, at least privately, to come to some conclusion here?
For whatever reason, and here I must give some praise to President Trump, he doesn't like these conflicts. He doesn't like war and killings of this kind, and he wants ceasefires. Ceasefires would be satisfactory for him as a way to stop the killing and then maybe move on toward some peaceful solution. So he got the ceasefire, though no real peace and no effective plans to move much further in Gaza. And he tried to convince Putin in Alaska to have a ceasefire in Ukraine as well, and Putin refused. And that angered Trump. And so then he said, well, maybe Ukraine can win the war, and he got upset with Putin. But apparently with the last phone call, he's ready to agree to at least see a ceasefire and move on and make these radical concessions to Putin and at the price of Ukraine. So we'll see. But in general, the killings in both cases will stop, which one has to say is at least a good thing.
Yeah, and also the Mideast peace deal meant that Qatar, Egypt, Turkey were part of these negotiations, UAE, Saudi Arabia, et cetera. Right. And the same has to be said in the Ukrainian-Russian side. And we can't forget about Iran, we can't forget about North Korea and China, which have been quiet, but we know there's backing there. How much should these global partners be involved? Can they be brought to the table in any legitimate way?
Most of the powers that you mentioned, including China, would like these wars to end, right? They want to do business. The Qataris, the Saudis, all of the Gulf states, China as well, is mostly concerned with its own economic well-being, which at least China feels is threatened by the United States, and the wars don't do them any good. So China has actually been trying to urge Putin at various points to stop the war, to make concessions, etc., but has failed. So it seems to me that in some ways, a lot of these powers are on the same side, and it's convincing Netanyahu in one hand and Putin on the other that enough is enough. Be satisfied what you've achieved, horrible that it's been, and let's get out of this fighting.
All right. Well, I'm going to be responsible in knowing that we could continue on for a long time and accidentally cut off, and instead end the conversation here. So thank you so much, Dr. Suny, for your insights on this. In one sentence, literally one sentence, what do you think we're missing about this?
We're missing the larger global picture that, in fact, many countries in the world want to go their own way, want to settle things in their own regions, and they begin to give a kind of quizzical eye toward the United States, which they see no longer as a dependable power, one that they can rely on in the long run.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Suny. We appreciate your time, and we hope you'll join us at a later date.
Anytime.
Thank you. And for all of you out there, we'll see you next week at 4:30. Have a great afternoon.